Hi, everyone, and welcome. It's really lovely to see such a great crew here with us this afternoon, and thank you so much for joining. My name is Nikki Lefebvre, and I'm the Executive Director of the Natick Historical Society. I'll be hosting this afternoon's program on behalf of three neighbors and colleagues, and I'll tell you who they are in order from east to west. That's Clara Silverstein of Historic Newton, Taylor Kallick of Wellesley Historical Society, and Laura Rankin of the Framingham History Center. Route 9, A Journey Through Time, is exciting for many reasons, and chief among them is the opportunity to work together across town boundaries to share really great local history. If you're here this afternoon, it's likely because you feel a strong connection to one of the four towns in this collaboration. But I urge you today to look beyond your town and check out the great local history programming that's happening in all of our communities. Route 9 is just one of many great historical subjects that really reminds us that history does not begin and end at town lines. History transcends them. I'm excited to be here this afternoon too as part of a program that, through our really fun collaboration among local history organizations, also transcends town lines. We have four excellent local history experts here with us this afternoon to guide us on our path, and I'm happy to introduce each of them to you now, and I'll do that in order of their speaking. First, Terry Evans has served on the board of the Natick Historical Society since 2010. At the NHS, Terry led the development of historic signage along the Kitchituate Rail Trail, and she has presented numerous talks and walking tours about Natick's past. Her favorite spot along Route 9 is the easily missed rise in the roadway near the Wellesley-Natick line, where the Kitchituate Aqueduct crosses beneath the road. And when she isn't researching Natick's history, you can find Terry giving architectural history tours, walking tours as a volunteer with Boston by Foot, which she's done since 2004. Alden Ludlow has been with the Wellesley Historical Society for 8 years and has held a number of positions, including processing archivist, project archivist, and research coordinator. His favorite spot along Route 9 is the section in Wellesley that passes through the town forest near Longfellow Pond. And when Alden isn't researching local history, you can find him playing music, reading, or hiking. Kevin Swope has been with the Framingham History Center for 18 years and has served in a variety of ways, including as past president of the board. His favorite landmark on Route 9 is the new Scrub-a-Dub car wash in Framingham. And when he isn't studying Framingham's past, you can find Kevin on a sailboat. Clara Silverstein has served Historic Newton for 7 years as the community engagement manager. Clara's favorite spot on Route 9 is the stone overpass near Chestnut Street in Newton. And when Clara isn't studying local history, you can find her running or cooking up some historic recipes, which sounds like a lot of fun, Clara. I'm really grateful to all of our speakers for all the work they've done in preparing this presentation for you this afternoon. The talk will run about 40 minutes altogether, and then we'll open it up to questions. So take a moment to locate at the bottom of your screen the question and answer function, and that's how you can send your questions to my colleague Laura Rankin of Framingham History Center and we'll do our best together to sort of get through the Q&A and get as many of your great questions out there as possible. And now, before we begin, I'll start us off with sort of a big picture thought before I turn it over to Terry. Though Route 9 today is thought of as a 20th and 21st century phenomenon, it has more than 2 centuries of history behind it. Conceived in the early 19th century as a throughway connecting Worcester and Boston, today it is a diverse and evolving corridor of retail, residential, and commercial development, and a powerful economic driver for the communities it passes through. Whether you consider it a commuter corridor, a retail mecca, or a moat that divides communities, and whether you call it Boylston Street, Worcester Road, or Turnpike Road, no doubt Route 9 has shaped aspects of your daily life, as it has for so many local residents for more than 200 years. Now, over to you, Terry.
Thank you, Nikki. Before I start into my talk, I want to briefly point out the map that you see before you on the screen. If you have a chance later in more detail to look at this map through the Leventhal Map Center at Boston Public Library, you can see right across the middle of your screen the Worcester Turnpike as it runs through Newton and present-day Wellesley, including the taverns and toll houses that are marked on the graphic. As we begin this journey through time, it's important to note that the Worcester Turnpike was not the first major road in Massachusetts. The roads established by early European settlers often trace the paths and ways created by the Massachusetts and Nipmuc people who walked this land for generations before the Europeans arrived, and whose descendants continue to do so today. In Massachusetts, coastal and inland post roads with winding routes shaped by local topography were developed in the 17th and 18th centuries. Today, their traces can be found in local street names, including the Old Connecticut Path in Framingham and Wayland, Hartford Street in Natick, and the Boston Post Road in Wayland and Weston. Unlike the way we think of transportation today as a matter of public works, turnpikes and bridges in the early days of the country were largely for-profit ventures. Though there were toll roads and turnpikes in Massachusetts in the late 18th century, the turnpike era began in earnest in 1805 with the General Court's passage of the first Corporation Act, created specifically for turnpike companies and requiring that a charter not be granted until the route had been reviewed and its tolls approved. With enthusiastic support from investors in Worcester and communities along the route, the Worcester Turnpike Corporation was incorporated in Boston on March 7, 1806, and the first meeting of its shareholders was held on October 30th of that year in a Hanover Street concert hall in Boston on what is today part of City Hall Plaza. Among its best known champions and shareholders was Revolutionary War patriot and printer Isaiah Thomas, who began publishing the treasonous newspaper, The Massachusetts Spy, in 1770. Living in Worcester after the Revolution, he was instrumental in founding the Turnpike Corporation and served as one of its founding directors. As a printer and businessman, Thomas saw turnpikes as a good investment for shipping commercial goods. 600 shares were issued at $250 apiece, raising $150,000 in capital, or about $3.5 million today, to cover the anticipated cost of construction. Of the communities on the proposed route, Newton, with its proximity to Boston, was apparently less vested in the project, as Newton residents accounted for just 16 of the 600 shares sold. The selling point for investors was the proposed layout of the route. Working on the principle that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, making this attractive to travelers, the Turnpike's Layout Committee proposed that the road run as straight as possible with little regard for topographical challenges. With the hills and swamps along the route, that would prove to be a costly proposition. Once the route was finally agreed, the Brookline boundary with Boston, pictured here where the Gateway Arch is, or once stood, that was designated as the toll road's starting point. From a point near the Punch Bowl Tavern in Brookline Village, the road of the Turnpike past Mitchell's Tavern in Newton, crossing the Charles River at Newton Upper Falls near a rolling mill north of Echo Gorge, passing through the part of Needham that is today Wellesley by the home of Enoch Fisk, now where the site of Mass Bay Community College, to the neck of the ponds, the narrowest point on Lake Cochituate in Natick, and through to Framingham and Points West, crossing Lake Quinsigamond on a floating bridge to end in Worcester. The road, which was 40 miles long and 66 feet wide, was completed in 1810 and had a dirt surface. The floating bridge used to cross Lake Quinsigamond sank in 1817 and was replaced with a fixed bridge. Of the mile markers that once stood along the Turnpike, there are only two that remain. The mile 7 marker that you see here from Newton, and one that marked the midpoint of the Turnpike's route that is with the Framingham History Center. So it's no coincidence that the only town along the route was Framingham, or present-day Framingham Center. Framingham was on the straightest line connecting Boston and Worcester and had some enthusiastic Turnpike champions, including Abner Wheeler, pictured here, whose hotel would virtually abut the new road. The key to collecting tolls, of course, was to minimize the points where travelers could jump on and off the turnpike, evading the toll houses on the route, or what was known as shunpiking. And if you look at the graphic, the top graphic on the screen, on the left-hand side, you'll see that gate that swung open and closed to let travelers pass after paying their tolls. Initially, the Worcester Turnpike was established with 4 toll gates spaced at 10 miles each. This proved to be inefficient in terms of stopping shunpikers. And in 1809, there was an act of the legislature that allowed the Turnpike Corporation to install additional gates with prorated tolls. Of these 4 towns today, there were tolls in Newton and Wellesley. It should be noted, and this is one of my favorite things on the Turnpike tolls, the Newton Highlands stop was strategically sited, surrounded by marsh, so that there was no way that you could work around it, and you had to pass through the toll. Toll collector Daniel Dadman tended to the Wellesley toll house that once stood on the turnpike at Weston Road, then Blossom Street. And in the picture in the bottom center of the screen, you note a couple of things. One is it is astonishingly close to the road that passed by it. And then the other is, of course, that you can see the surface where it was simply packed dirt. In 1975, the house was acquired by the Wellesley Historical Society as the Dadman McNamara House and moved to its current location on the north side of the intersection of Route 9 and Route 16. The turnpike did more than move travelers along the 40-mile route. While Framingham and Newton Highlands were established communities, travelers needed places to dine, to stay, and post offices like the one established by William Farris at his store at the foot of Walnut Street in Natick along the turnpike, and served stagecoaches carrying the mail. Establishments catering to travelers on the route included the 1770 Richards Tavern at the Brookline Newton line. It ran, literally, the turnpike ran right behind it. The Mitchell Tavern at Center Street, and Cook Tavern at Elliott and Woodward in Newton. The Haynes Tavern on the north side of the turnpike in Natick. And of course, Abner Wheeler's Hotel in Framingham. You can see Wheeler's Hotel in this image on your screen, center and to the right, and I will note you'll be hearing more about it later this talk. The number of travelers peaked on the turnpike around the early 1830s. 1831 saw an estimated 22,360 travelers, and the average travel time between Boston and Worcester was a speedy 6 to 7 hours, with the lowest fare being $2. But the enterprise remained unprofitable, with lower toll proceeds than anticipated, and with pressure from the towns it passed through to keep the roads in good repair. And if shunpiking wasn't enough, another problem was just around the corner in the form of the steam locomotive, and the days of the New England turnpikes were numbered. When the new Boston and Worcester Railroad was completed in 1831, turnpike owners recognized that it was a competitive threat and petitioned that the tracks not run anywhere near the turnpike. In Natick and Framingham, the line was laid a few miles to the south, and the economic boom that had been triggered by the turnpike shifted along with it. In Framingham, it had the effect of establishing a new commercial and industrial hub around the rail line in the southern part of town. While in Natick, it transformed what had been a cottage shoe business into a major industry around a new Natick center, opening access to national markets via railroad and establishing a factory model of production. In 1832, the Turnpike Corporation petitioned the Norfolk County Commissioners to have the toll road from Kimball Tavern in Wellesley, Punch Bowl Tavern in Brookline, laid out as a common and public highway. And the residents instructed the Needham selectmen to oppose this request, having the turnpike relinquish their responsibilities and in fact shift the burden of maintenance to the towns. But the Norfolk County Commissioners the following year accepted the request. On September 1st, 1841, the General Court accepted the turnpike proprietor's petition to surrender its charter, making all of the turnpike a free county road. And in the years that followed, the road fell into disrepair and was largely abandoned west of Framingham. Little used between Newton and Framingham for the rest of the century, the old turnpike was encroached on and modified. In 1846, the tracks of the new north-south Saxonville spur of the Boston and Worcester Railroad cut across the old road, with a grade crossing at Lake Cochituate. 2 years later, the creation of the Foss Reservoir in Framingham would claim a part of the road, which was relocated to its south. Today, a stub marked the Old Worcester Road would have led to the shoreline of the Foss Reservoir. It would take a new transportation technology at the turn of the next century to give the Worcester Turnpike new life.
Let's take a closer look at the period from about 1900 into the 1930s. By 1900, the Turnpike era is over, and the road is somewhat disused route for horse or carriage traffic. Let's take a closer look at the period from about 1900 into the 1930s. By 1900, the Turnpike era is over, and the road is a somewhat disused route for the horse and carriage traffic. But big plans are already on the horizon. As it is so many times, our route is about to be transformed, bringing it into a new era of use with modern transportation infrastructure. The biggest changes to the Worcester Turnpike from 1900 into the 1930s was the development and then the abandonment of the Boston and Worcester Street Rail, which almost exclusively stuck to the old Turnpike route and kept it relevant well into the planning stages for what would become Route 9. Here we see the route as it passes through Newton, Wellesley, Natick, and Framingham. And in addition to the main route, many spur lines were developed during this time. By 1900, Worcester Street was mostly a locally used road, and much of it was still a country lane. Along much of the stretch, it was almost entirely residential, with services provided only for local residents. Here's a view up Worcester Street about 1900. The road is closely lined by residences and farms. Most of the activity, commercial and otherwise, was centered on the various intersections with other major roads. This is the old Goodyear House, which is still extant in Wellesley Hills. Along our route, farms and residences were right on the roadway. This is what traffic on Worcester Street would have looked like circa 1902 or 1903, after the Turnpike era and just before the construction of the Boston and Worcester Street Rail. Delivery wagons would have been a common sight on the road. This business block's descendants now have a Washington Street address, but at the time they were directly on the old Turnpike Road. The street rail tracks would be built close to where this wagon is pictured. Here's a broader view from the previous slide looking west. Horse-drawn wagons were the travel technology of the day. This intersection would be one of the contentious sticking points in the development of Route 9 decades after this photo was taken. The intersection of Parker and Worcester Streets looks quite bucolic, and it's a far cry from today's hustle and bustle at this overpass. Most of the old Turnpike Road consistently looked like this through our four towns during the time just prior to the street rail. Telephone and telegraph poles lined the road for its entire length. Stone walls were a ubiquitous sight and can still be seen along the route in several places today. Here we have the arrival of the street railway, which ran service from Boston to Framingham Junction from 1903 to 1932. The company had been chartered in 1901 and construction had started immediately. Though the rail was in operation for 3 decades, service schedules were cut back extensively by 1916. And by 1925, many segments of the line, particularly in the Framingham area, were operated using buses. By 1932, the route was entirely buses. Here's a close-up of a typical Boston and Worcester, what they called a closed street rail car of that time period. Here's Framingham Center showing the B&W street rail and spur line. This is now the intersection of Worcester Street and Edgell Road. This photo shows the closed car design on the left and the open car design on the right. Generally, the Boston Worcester cars were closed and the spur line cars were either closed or open. Here we see the B&W street rail on a snowy day in about 1910. Washington Street on the left, now Route 16, and Worcester Street there on the right. In the central triangle area had been this Elm Park Hotel, which had been a busy stopping point during the days of the Turnpike. The hotel was raised in 1908, with decline and decay being the reasons given in the accounts of the time. It had been a hotel and then a boarding house, and by the time it was torn down, it had outlived its usefulness as a waypoint along the route. The magnificent Dillaway House at 535 Worcester Street in 1904 on a snowy day. The B&W trolley tracks are visible on the foreground and had built not long before this picture was taken. This house is still extant, but as much along Route 9 has been extensively renovated and is now obscured from the road by trees and fencing. Here's a view up the Worcester Street on October 26, 1906, with the B&W street rail and the Lake Cochituate South Pond to the right. If you were standing today where this photo was taken, which I would not recommend, the expanded town waterworks are just ahead on the right and the car dealerships just past that further up the road. Here we see two transportation technologies together. We have the street rail car taking on passengers next to the horse water fountain and hitching area. This picture was taken in about 1907. A look up Worcester Street facing west, approaching the intersection with Western Road, which was then known as Blossom Street. The old Mansfield house is on the left. This photo likely was taken at the time the trolley service was already beginning to curtail service, circa 1915. Much of our route looked like this until Route 9 was planned. Inset is a photo of the Mansfield house as it looked in 1968. And even by 1968, Route 9 was a very busy road. Here's an article from the Wellesley Townsman from October 30th, 1925. And this is one of the first inklings that we get there's going to be a Route 9. This article, excerpted here, reviews the initial concerns people had with the route: trucks. This was literally the NIMBY, not in my backyard, principle at work. Residents were worried that truck traffic would pass through Wellesley and Weston would get all the touring pleasure cars. This photo, circa 1925, shows that the road was in decent repair in some of the residential areas. At this point, the street railway was winding down service, though it would continue until 1932. The Bird Bancroft House is still extant. Construction on Route 9 began in 1930. Work on the route commenced in many areas simultaneously, but initial impetus came from the construction west of our geographic focus. By 1929, construction planning for the road between Worcester and just west of Framingham was well underway. A view of construction in the Wellesley Hills area. Widening of the route was a priority. Many trees were clearly removed. There were controversies surrounding the construction from the beginning, ranging from how construction would impact the communities to issues regarding the employment of workers. Controversies erupted during construction, as this Townsman article shows. War veterans were to be given priority for construction employment. However, the issue was due to the impact of the Great Depression, unemployment was widespread. Many communities along the route argued that priority should be given to local people to be hired for these construction jobs. Here's another view of construction. This is the area around Route 9, Cliff Road, and the railroad tracks in Wellesley Hills. As an archival note, we have in our collections many images of the progress of construction in this area because the Clapp family, living on Cliff Road, went out regularly with their camera to take photographs. This photograph was taken from their property at 5 Cliff Road. Here's another shot showing construction between Cliff Road and Rockland Roads looking west down Washington Street. Construction was messy, especially during the winter months. Route 9 is out of view on the left, and construction of Route 9 made connections and avoiding existing infrastructure in the area a problem. There were railroad tracks and parallel crossing roads and many things that had to be worked around. Here we see the intersection of Worcester Street and Western Road, the former Blossom Street, in the late 1920s to the early 1930s. This photo is sort of a last gasp of the scene people have been used to for decades, just prior to the beginning of the construction along our route. The era of automobiles is underway. From turnpike to country road to street rail corridor, our route is now on the brink of yet another transformation into a modern highway. As we will see in this next segment, we're entering an era entirely catered to convenience and automobiles.
Hi, I'm going to tell you about the Worcester Turnpike during the automobile age. Of course, cars were around for decades before 1930, but as you've just heard, it wasn't until it was officially designated Route 9 and paved in the 1930s that the old turnpike truly became an automobile road. And what a road it was. Here we are looking from our vantage point on top of the Parker Street overpass in Newton, facing east. 4 lanes wide of concrete roadway with a grass median and gravel shoulders. One could easily get up to speeds of 60 to 65 miles per hour, previously unheard of outside of a racetrack. True miracle of modern engineering. Look at that road. Incidentally, that bus belongs to what was previously known as the Boston Worcester Street Railway Company. They, of course, had been forced to change modes of transportation when the trolley tracks were taken up. As you can see from this clipping from the Framingham News in 1938, the road still had a few minor quirks to be worked out. Be happy to hear that the flooding issue at the junction of 126 was addressed by the construction of a brand new catchment basin in 2022. But it was a wide open road, about the size it is now, with no traffic. Well, except for the 70,000 car backup that was caused in November 1939 by Admiral Byrd's snow cruiser. This enormous vehicle was designed to drive to the South Pole from the edge of the Antarctic ice shelf. But first it had to drive from Chicago, where it was built, to Boston, where it would be loaded onto a ship. This is a photo of it approaching Framingham on Route 9 from the west. As you can see, this same photo was used for the front page of the next day's Boston Herald. Unfortunately, the snow cruiser proved completely unable to drive in frozen wastes of Antarctica, but it did quite well on Route 9, at least until it reached Wellesley Hills. According to the Worcester Gazette, quote, rolling down the hill at 15 miles an hour, the cruiser clipped off a 20-foot street lamp at its base. Dr. Poulter, whose vision had been partly obscured by a dirty windshield, stopped the vehicle before further damage resulted. Well, there are plenty of lampposts, he observed philosophically as he backed the cruiser onto the highway again and proceeded towards Boston. But except for the odd snow cruiser, there was little traffic because most of Route 9 was lined with houses, farms, and trees, as this aerial view in Framingham looking at the Route 126 overpass shows. You know, there's just that one church in the lower foreground. I think I have a closer view. Wait, that's no church. That's a Howard Johnson's. Boy, that didn't take long. In truth, development along Route 9 actually did take a few years because, of course, it was finished in the 1930s, which was the height of the Great Depression. Howard Johnson's did arrive by 1939, as can be seen from this ad, but there were only a few other local restaurants. One example was the Echo Farm Spa, which boasted a supposedly healthful barometric spring. They added a restaurant and a tourist hotel. After the war, it was renamed the Wishing Well, which you can see in the postcard in the lower right. This restaurant and the spring was demolished to create the cloverleaf for exit 111 on the Massachusetts Turnpike in the 1950s. Another example of a local restaurant opened to take advantage of Route 9 was the Abner Wheeler House. Abner Wheeler, if you recall, was one of the original investors in the Worcester Turnpike in the 1800s and had owned the hotel at Framingham Center. Now, more than 100 years later, his home was turned into a restaurant. This stood at the approximate location of the Bee Sisters Cafe in Framingham. More modern restaurant was the Mirador. You can see it in a couple of different forms here. Its original roadside restaurant of 1939 and the larger version for the age of the tail fins of 1950s. This stood roughly where Walgreens and Trader Joe's now are in Framingham. Most of the big restaurants actually closed during World War II with gas and other forms of rationing. But they reopened in 1945 and they were soon joined by new competitors. Vaughn Monroe, a popular vocalist of the time, and you can see him there with some of his fans, opened his nightclub, The Meadows, in Framingham in May 1946. He broadcast his weekly Camel Cigarette radio show live from the club once a week. A restaurant known for its after-hours music was Christie's, located where China Gourmet is now on Route 9 West in Framingham next to the Mass Pike on-ramp. Its owner, Eddie Curran, was a jazz fan. He would host famous players after they had completed their other gigs in the area. A jam session there from 1951 featuring Charlie Parker was released on record 10 years later. The restaurant later became the site of the Red Coach Grill. But the best place to see shows during this era was probably the Monticello, opened in 1957. Located across the street from Shoppers World in Framingham, the club featured big acts such as Louis Armstrong, Mitzi Gaynor, and Frankie Lane, as seen from this ad from the Globe in 1967. In 1970, Diana Ross's first ever show after leaving the Supremes was at the Monticello in Framingham. Of course, while most of the development happened in Framingham, there were restaurants elsewhere along Route 9. Chicken Depot at 915 Worcester Street in Natick had opened by 1946. Can't have been that successful, however, because it was soon replaced by James H. McManus's ice cream stand at the same location. You can see that it's there in the 50s. One of the only international foods you could find in those days were Chinese restaurants. Chin's Village at 981 Worcester Street in Wellesley lasted at least 25 years, as proved by the commemorative ashtray seen here. And of course, there's one restaurant you can still eat at. That's Ken's Steakhouse, which has been owned by the Hanna family since 1941. But you may not know there's another Route 9 eatery from the area you can still visit too, only you have to be willing to travel to Dearborn, Michigan. Lammy's Diner was located at 1824 Worcester Road in Framingham from 1951 to 1953, but now serves lunch in the Henry Ford Museum. Another business that grew up to serve travelers was motels. There are postcards of three early ones, the Siesta and the Wayside in Framingham, and then the Sunset Plaza in Natick. If you're looking for someplace more modern to stay, maybe the Wellesley Motor Inn, or Charter House in Newton, or the Travelodge in Natick would do. And you know that these establishments were as beautiful on the inside as they were on the outside. These are interior shots from the Howard Johnson's and Holiday Inn in Framingham, as well as the pleasingly blue room from the Charter House in Newton. Of course, there were other businesses along Route 9. Perhaps the most prominent was the Carling Brewery in Natick, which was later replaced by Prime Computer, Boston Scientific, and is now a satellite campus of MathWorks. In the background, you can see the old Natick Drive-In. But what Route 9 is really known for, of course, is retail. Shoppers World was truly a game changer when it opened in Framingham in 1951. The Jordan Marsh Flying Saucer had landed in suburbia. As you can see, it was still surrounded mostly by trees, although the neighborhoods of 1950s tract homes can also be seen sprouting up around the area. Shoppers World had an interesting design in that the original version had an open air courtyard. Customers still stepped outside when going from store to store. Auto shows, design shows, holiday celebrations were all staged in the courtyard, providing what the late architect Chris Walsh called the town center of Framingham's automobile age. Here's another view of the open air concept at the center of the original Shoppers World, merry-go-rounds and other diversions for the kids. 15 years later, Shoppers World had competition from a new style of shopping center. The quote, climate-controlled all-weather Natick Mall opened in April 1966 on land formerly leased by the town of Framingham for its septic fields. With all these amenities, why wouldn't you want to live out in the suburbs, even if you couldn't afford to buy a house? Especially if your job was at one of the businesses then sprouting out up around Route 128. Apartments started growing like mushrooms, especially in Framingham, beginning in the 1960s. Many were on Route 9, such as the Executive, the Edgewater, the Framingham Reservoir, and the Sovereign Apartments, which was just a stone's throw away. All of these were built during the 1960s. On the right, you can see this ad for the Sovereign Apartments for 1964 still boasted of, quote, traffic-free driving. We're surrounded by the new Mass Turnpike, routes 409, 495, and 128. So now we're going to end our talk exactly where I began, atop the Parker Street overpass, 30 years later, looking west and wondering where all of our traffic-free driving has gone.
Well, in this section of the talk, I'm going to be addressing some of that, as well as taking a look at other ways that commercial activity along Route 9 were consolidating. Some shopping areas were being added, but by the early 21st century, many malls and shopping plazas were being renovated and reimagined for other uses, not just retail, but you still generally needed a car to get there. This shows a typical commercial area along Route 9 in the early 1970s. This is in Wellesley. And many malls built in the 50s and 60s were for the convenience of drivers, not beauty. You can see here that there is a kind of, not, shall we say, aesthetically pleasing building surrounded by a lake of parking, all for the convenience of drivers. The first tenant at this shopping plaza in Chestnut Hill was Stop and Shop, which opened in 1957. And also you'll note that here there wasn't really a sense of an anchor tenant. Stop and Shop was a store and there were disparate other retail establishments around it. The mall at Chestnut Hill, which opened in 1973, offered a somewhat new concept. Its design offered a fully enclosed mall with an open air center and stores surrounding it. You saw something similar with the Natick Mall in the earlier part of this presentation. Here, this one had 2 stories, which was somewhat of a novelty at the time. Bloomingdale's opened in 1974 as an upscale anchor tenant at the mall at Chestnut Hill. It's still there, and it's the only New England location of Bloomingdale's. This mall is one of the rare ones along Route 9 with staying power. Its design is fairly intact, with the courtyard surrounded by 2 stories of retail establishments. And of course, the stores themselves have kind of gone over the years. Some of you might enjoy hearing some of the establishments that were there in the 70s, KB Drugs, Paperback Booksmith, Fannie Farmer Candies, and those have all gone. But now we have a range from the upscale Tiffany & Company and Coach designer bags, and then the more middle-brow Uniqlo, the Cheesecake Factory, and Frank Pepe's Pizza. Another trend that was growing in the 1970s was malls as entertainment centers, including with movies. You can't see too well, but behind is the sign for the General Cinema Company that started in 1939 operating drive-in movies, but then decided, let's put the movie theaters at the malls because that's where the customers are. And this is the first of these in-mall cinemas that opened in the entire US. It was at Shoppers World, and it opened in 1951. And the company liked being in malls so much that they opened their main their main headquarters at the Chestnut Hill Shopping Center. That's very near the mall at Chestnut Hill that you saw earlier. That opened in 1975 and also, of course, was a huge movie theater there. And when you think about it, why would you want to go outside when you can be inside this nice climate-controlled world, watching movies and shopping? Because that's what was outside. Another thing that the mall at Chestnut Hill attracted was some housing. And the towers of Chestnut Hill opened in the late 1970s and have been a popular place to live ever since. There are now 423 luxury condos in this multi-story building. It's called the Towers at Chestnut Hill still, and the units have held their value, perhaps because this is located on 17 acres of land, although I still wouldn't call this an especially pedestrian-friendly area unless you just happen to be walking down the street to go into the mall. Luxury housing was also added near the new Natick Mall when it underwent renovations in 2008. And these condos are called Nouvelle, which is the word in French for new of Natick. The atrium represents an extreme version of an enclosed luxury shopping mall. It opened in 1989 as a vertical mall, was self-contained, and it had parking below. Its concept was upscale stores and services. The Boston Globe, around the time it opened, wrote, "Atrium shoppers will be among the most pampered, coddled, petted, and patted of consumers. They'll be greeted at the front door by a doorman in a custom-made uniform who will lead them either to the valet parking or the coat and package check room." Well, unfortunately, this concept didn't catch on all that well. Despite Henry Bendel as an anchor tenant, the mall had trouble consistently filling its empty storefronts, and it closed in 2014. An article in Boston.com surmised that the mall suffered from overreach and was seen as, and I'm quoting here, a gaudy, inaccessible fortress by what few customers it had. But that's not the end of the story with the atrium, because it decided to reinvent itself as an atrium center. And it has no retail shopping anymore, but it is using the space for other tenants, including the Time Life Fitness Center, doctor's offices, and even a Dana-Farber Cancer Institute facility. A mix of tenants also defines another area. This is a little east of the atrium in Chestnut Hill. You saw this area earlier with the image of Stop and Shop. After a fire destroyed some of the buildings here in 2000, the site was completely renovated. And it's now called Chestnut Hill Square. It includes a Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Facility, an Equinox Fitness Club, and the Capitol Grill Steakhouse, among many other businesses. So it's also going for that mix of tenants. Well, speaking of grocery stores, this shopping area east of the mall contains a Stop and Shop, Chestnut Hill Square that you just saw. And the mix at, this was called the Chestnut Hill Shopping Center. And in the 1970s, it had two very pedestrian businesses, R.H. Stearns, which is a department store, and the Star Market. Well, the Star Market's still there, but everything around it has changed. In 2012, this shopping center received a new name, The Street, and a complete makeover. Out went Macy's, and in went Sports Club LA, the Shake Shack, Lululemon, and other tenants. Its look also changed, but interestingly, there was some debate even for a commercial area about how it would look. The Chestnut Hill Association posted a notice on its blog in 2016 about a redesign of some of the structures at the street, and it prompted these responses. One writer said, "I'm very happy to see this proposal to rejuvenate these tired old buildings and replace them with something that will be more attractive. I always welcome commercial development as it reduces the property tax burden on us homeowners." But someone with a different point of view said, "I'd like to see more, not less, open space, but also less traffic, less development, just less. Raise my taxes if you need to, but stop the trend of more development is better. It almost never is." But we can see how that debate turned out, which side came out ahead. Development at the street does continue, and construction is now underway for a 90,000 square foot development in the old General Cinema Theater. That went out as more people are having their entertainment streaming for them. But at this new complex, there's more room for retail, restaurants, and other businesses, and it's going to open later this year. The building does have space in front for outdoor activities, including dining. So what we're really seeing overall in this last period of development along Route 9 is that the concept of a commercial area as a town square is back, bringing us full circle to the days when a destination along Route 9 meant a place not just for shopping, but also with room for pedestrians, social gatherings, and outdoor interactions.
Thank you, Clara. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of our presenters, Terry, Alden, Kevin, and Clara. Every time I've heard you working on this presentation, I've learned a little bit more, and I imagine so many of us here this afternoon listening to you have learned quite a bit. So in fact, if you've enjoyed this presentation this afternoon, then I would encourage you to check out the website of your local history organization and make a contribution, because it's only with support from our community members that we can continue to offer programs like this one to enrich our understanding of the land around us. So thanks very much to all of our presenters. And I also want to acknowledge our good friend Taylor Calick and Wellesley on the slides, who was excellent. Thank you, Taylor. And now I'll invite my colleague Laura to come back on. Laura and I will take your questions as they come, and we've got some interesting ones flowing in. So give us a moment and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. And I also want to invite all of our presenters to turn your cameras back on so that we can have sort of a nice group conversation, and a silent Zoom round of applause to all of you. Thank you so much. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Laura to get us going on the questions.
All right, thanks, Nikki. We got some great questions coming in. So I'm going to start at the top. We had a question for Terry. Where exactly are the 2 mile markers located that you mentioned?
Thank you. And I'm pleased to say that the one in Framingham is actually part of the Framingham History Center collections. And I understand, and Clara, correct me if I'm wrong, that the Newton Stone is at the end of Hartford Street against a fence abutting private property.
That I'd have to double check on, but there definitely is one in Newton.
That is what the notes I have from the society say. So unless it's moved somewhere since then.
I don't think it's moved.
Okay.
Excellent.
Great. Oh, great.
No,
Thank
one
you.
more follow-up for her. Sorry.
Oh, go for it. Yeah.
The other question is, how did they lock the gates to prevent travelers from hopping over the gate and unlocking it themselves? That's a great question.
It is, and there's a reason that that toll gates had toll houses, because the toll taker lived there, and so he would, if it was at night, he would awaken to any sound, to the sounds of someone, if someone was trying to make an end run. And I'm guessing every so often there was probably somebody who got through. But the reason that every toll gate had an an on-site live-in toll taker was to try to reduce the likelihood of that.
Thank you, Terry. I've got a question for Alden here, and Alden, I'm going to sort of tie two questions together. One is about how did they lay the tracks for the street rail just right onto those dirt roads? And relatedly, about the arrival of the streetcars, did the railroad from Boston to Worcester cause the streetcars on Route 9 to cease, or was it just from the desire for automobiles? Was the streetcar in competition with the railroad for passenger traffic, or was the railroad much more for deliveries and storekeepers and freight and so forth? So any context on that transition?
Okay, I'll take the first part on the street rail tracks. One of the problems with the road when it was the Worcester Turnpike was in fact that there were so many hills. So even at the time that it was a turnpike, the roads were less than optimal. When they got muddy or anything like that, the traffic got bogged down and the hills just made it worse. So yes, they did sort of regrade a little bit and they widened the road when they put the street rail in, but it still wasn't optimal because the hills, especially when you go through Wellesley and into Framingham and through Natick, especially in Natick, there's that big hill. Those presented problems, I'm sure, especially in the wintertime with ice and snow. As far as the railroad goes, the railroad, there's two things. There's the Boston and Worcester Street Rail, which was the one that was on Route 9. And there was the Boston and Worcester Railroad, which later on was sort of subsumed into the Boston and Albany Railroad. And that Boston and Worcester Railroad had been in existence from the 1830s. It was chartered in the 1830s. So there was passenger and there was freight on the railroad, but they weren't really covering the same ground. So mainly it was cars. It was automobiles that sort of was the demise of the street rail.
So we do have a question about Lamy's Diner. And so Kevin, I'm looking at you here. Do you know what's on the site of Lamy's Diner now?
It was basically on the, it was on Route 9 eastbound, so on the south side of Route 9, sort of near where Staples is, and that, you know, that crossing Boulevard and all that, that's where it was. It was only there for a few years. The interesting thing about Lamy's Diner was that the actual Mr. Lamy was from Marlborough, and he bought, or actually paid to have that diner built in Worcester by a diner corporation. And it was located in Marlborough for a couple of years. Then it was moved to Hudson for a few years. And then somebody else bought it and moved it to Framingham for a few years. And Framingham was its sort of terminal destination. And it wound up in somebody's backyard until the Ford Museum took it and restored it. But it always had the name of Lamy's Diner, even though Mr. Lamy, I think, only ran it when it was in Marlborough.
Oh, wow. What a history. That's fascinating. I think I've got a question here that I'll probably turn both to Terry and Alden, but any insight as to why some intersections were constructed as exits and overpasses and some with traffic lights? I don't know if Terry, if you want to answer the earlier piece of this, and Kevin, it looks like you've got something to add as well. So maybe we'll start with Terry and the earliest part. No, you're muted, Terry.
Sorry, I would just say that's going to be one that Kevin can answer better, but I'll note only in Natick that we have a fine example of a 1930s overpass at the Worcester Turnpike and North Main Street. And then you had a grade crossing where you now have the Speed Street where they, in the 1970s, put one in. So largely, it depends on how much traffic there was, and I suppose to a point how much budget there was. I just want to cite those examples, kind of very local examples.
Great. Over to you, Kevin, I think.
Yeah, and I'll just follow up. It was all about politics, as you can imagine. I didn't have time to go into it, but I uncovered, because I always wondered why Edgell Road, there wasn't an overpass there until the 1960s. And there was actually originally a proposal to reroute the new Route 9 was going to go south of Framingham State University, south of that hill, and bypass that whole center area, because that actually was a little, that was the center of Framingham Center. But basically it came down to budget, and that they came to a compromise where they said, well, they would only make the road 60, it was only going to be 80 feet wide in Framingham and then 60 feet wide in Framingham Center. So it's that Route 9 was actually narrower in Framingham than it was in the rest of the route. But most of the places they tried to avoid grade crossings, and they did in Framingham. Route 126 was made an overpass at that point. Well, but that was the Framingham Center one was a huge bottleneck for decades to come.
Yeah. All right. And thank you, Kevin. Carrie, I think that Terry, this one comes back to you. It sounds like the Worcester Turnpike, like many others established at the time, were not directly profitable for investors. Was it nevertheless profitable for business interests in Worcester and the towns along the route, allowing them to more efficiently move goods to and from Boston and Worcester?
I would say it did so until the railroad came and got a faster, more efficient operation. So it did for the purposes of Isaiah Thomas and other businesses, and they could move stuff. Once it ceased to be a maintained road, it ceased to be maintained by a turnpike corporation, and it fell into disrepair. It didn't have the attraction, and again, you had the railroad 2 miles south for much of the route. So it did initially, I guess I'd say it that way.
Okay. And I think we've got a couple kind of, I'll just toss these out there for anyone who'd like to answer. I think, was Route 9 the first divided highway in the United States? That's some hearsay. Is that true? Does anybody know whether that was the case?
I always heard the Pennsylvania Turnpike, but I don't know when that was built exactly. It was the first in Massachusetts, I think.
Okay.
And probably the first in New England.
Okay, well, thank you to our questioner. We'll have to take that one up. I hadn't heard that, so that's interesting. And someone has a relative who lived in Natick and had told them that the trolley car tracks on Route 9 were never taken up, but just paved right over. Does anyone know if that's in fact the case?
They were taken up because when they took over the line, the state had the right to sell the steel as scrap.
Oh, that's interesting. There's a profit motive there.
Yes.
Right? Okay. And here's one for Alden. On one of your slides, the nickname, the airline for the Boston and Worcester Street Railroad was visible. Can anyone speak to that nickname?
I have no idea why it was called that, but that's what it says on that little advertisement. Looks like Terry has an answer.
Go ahead, Terry.
Just what happened, it's funny, the railroad took over from the old turnpike, and when the trolleys came up, they sold themselves on the fact that they were the clean, efficient, fast way of travel, not like those dated old steam locomotives. And so the airline was meant to convey this sense of modernity and speed and kind of a clean kind of commuter or passenger experience.
That was electrical too. Yeah, you didn't have any smoke.
Yep, no soot.
Okay, so we've got so many questions here, but I want to skip ahead and get a variety. Were there any major proposals for the Route 9 corridor that were rejected by town planning boards or by the state?
I know that there were issues in Wellesley that kept coming up again and again because they really wanted it to be a parkway. And they pretty much got what they wanted. I mean, the intersection there with Washington Street, which is now Route 16, and Route 9 was probably the most contentious point of the whole stretch. But when you look back at the discussion about it, everyone pretty much didn't want it to happen, but they also knew that the old Worcester Turnpike was the best place to have it. So in the end, it happened, and they pretty much got what they wanted. Through Wellesley, they got a parkway and they got the bypass at 16 and Route 9.
There was actually a debate, for that Framingham Center portion. That was debated in the, they had a special town meeting where they voted to put it on Worcester, on the existing turnpike line rather than go do the bypass route. The interesting sort of detail about that is that the original reason why they proposed the bypass was it would be cheaper for property takings, because if they put it right along the turnpike, there were a lot of businesses and everything in the center. And if they had made it 120 feet wide, which was their original plan, they would have had to buy out a lot of businesses and a lot of buildings. And if they'd run it south of the hill, they would not have had to do that. So the solution was to make it narrower so they wouldn't have to buy out as many. And then the other solution was apparently back in the, at that time, the tradition was the state would pay for the actual construction of the road, but the individual towns and cities would have to pay for taking of the property. So it would have been up to the town of Framingham to buy out the people along the route. So part of the route, the compromise that put it through Framingham Center, in addition to making it narrower, was that they capped what the town had to pay for in terms of property takings, and the state was going to cover anything above that. So, which seems consistent with the Framingham character. As long as it doesn't cost us any extra money, you can do whatever you want.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm noting that we've got a lot of questions that are sort of wondering what was on this site or what was the history of particular sites. And we're running out of time here. I'm not going to be able to ask all those, but I do want to encourage you to check in with your local historical society, because most of us handle research requests and respond to questions like that. So if you're feeling nostalgic and you just want to remember what was where when, please don't hesitate to check out what your local organization offers. I had a couple of people write in to say about the airline, that it had to do with the straightness of the path, right? Which our maps show very clearly, sort of straight as the bird flies, or straight and sort of straight as by flight. So a couple comments on that. Did anybody want to comment on Toll House cookies? No, Terry, you want to comment on something else though? Go ahead.
There were questions. Toll House cookies are a South Shore story, probably along with Dunkin' Donuts. And we could toss in Howard Johnson's into that too. But no, for the tolls, someone asked what the original tolls were, and they were, because there were, you had 4 toll gates, originally one every 10 miles, and the rates were 1 person on a horse, 4 cents, a 2-wheeled vehicle with a horse, 10 cents, a 4-wheeled vehicle with 2 horses was 25 cents, and there were other rates for oxen, sleds, and heads of livestock, and there were exemptions for traveling to church on Sunday. You got a free pass.
That's lovely. Thank you, Terry. I did see a question in here too about Route 9's association with Ted Williams. Terry, do you want to take that one?
Thank you. Yes, and that refers to the date that the Natick section of Route 9, the number for the great baseball great Ted Williams, was named the Ted Williams Highway in his honor. When you're driving east on Route 9 from Framingham to Natick, right around Shoppers World, you'll actually see one sign in the margin for that. And I will note that we have some photos, or we certainly have seen photos of Ted Williams, who came out for the dedication and for the unveiling.
Yes, his uniform number with the socks was 9.
Yes, I think I said that at the beginning.
Yeah. That's wonderful. And I think we have so many questions here. We're not going to get to them all. So I do want to encourage you to check out with your local history organization. And I think maybe what I'll do to just close us out here is ask our speakers, if you want to quickly just note one of your most surprising things you found in your research about Route 9, just a quick round robin, if you would.
I can start. One thing that interested me was the area around the mall at Chestnut Hill. And there's this beautiful natural area behind it called Hammond Pond Reservation. And for years, the malls just really had nothing to do with this natural area. And I note that the new building that's coming at the street is going to be oriented that way. In the past, you used to park and you'd see the pond and then you just go right inside the buildings. So I feel like there's a little more integration now about the site rather than just putting up whatever would go there without looking around. So I think that's an interesting full circle where nature is an attraction.
Thank you, Clara. Anyone else have a favorite surprise they found in their research? Or Alden, go ahead.
I was surprised at how many people in Wellesley had cameras between 1900 and 1932 and went outside and took pictures of construction and the changes in the community around them, which is, I mean, you look at the period before 1900 and we have very few photographs. And then all of a sudden, right around 1910 or so, there we have so many of them from the 20s and 30s in our collections. Going on with this construction and the area around that area.
That's great. A note to everyone that your records are important to your local historical societies. So
Yes,
don't think twice about donating. Kevin or Terry, any quick thoughts?
Are you want to go for it?
Okay, I was just going to say that I'm a planning nerd, as anybody who knows me knows. And it was actually seeing as when I was researching the turnpike and understanding kind of the turnpike got things started, then it was kind of put out of business by the railroad. The railroad was superseded in some respects by the trolley line. And it's that notion of how much transportation drives economic development and the physical kind of growth and shaping of communities.
Yeah. Thank you. And Kevin.
Yeah, just the politics. I went into it some, but just the politics of the route. Alden talked about the debates in Wellesley, and they proposed different routes. But this is very much a top-down project in a way that you can't do anymore. And just the way they just sort of, it was a big mystery until it was revealed. The state said, "All right, we're going to rebuild this whole road between Brookline and Worcester, and you guys are in the path."
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, I do want to note that there's lots of thanks and gratitude coming into the chat, and much appreciation for our thoughtful speakers, and I will underscore that and thank all of you for all the work and research you did to bring this presentation together today, and also to my colleagues Laura, Taylor, and Clara, who worked behind the scenes to make this presentation come together, and finally to all of you who've been here spending your Sunday afternoon with us. We hope that you look at Route 9 with fresh eyes that reference 2 centuries of history and more into the future. So with a rather quiet round of applause, a big thanks to all of our speakers and to all of the local history organizations in Newton, Wellesley, Framingham, and Natick. Thanks so much, everyone. That concludes our presentation today.